and welcome to Blossom Sandwich Sews. My name is Yvette and today I'm going to bring you some correct opinions only. This is the sewing edition of This or That. So I'm going to try, I think a lot of them are going to be things where it depends on the scenario, but also that's kind of boring if I just say, oh, it depends on every single one. So I'm going to pick, if I had to choose one of the options, which one am I going for? So this was originally an episode of the Love to Sew podcast, which if you haven't listened to it, I'd highly recommend. It's really informative. They do seasons now, so it's not usually on over the summer. But yeah, that podcast really helped me get into sewing. I picked up so much information and tips from Love to Sew. And so and then it's kind of come onto YouTube via the Curated Curvy. So they have put together a blog post with a reference of all the questions. So if you see me glancing off camera, I might be checking what the next question is. And I think I'm a bit behind on the trend of vloggers joining in with this because of, just getting back into my YouTube channel. But I was tagged in this sewing challenge by Agatha from In Agatha's Cottage, so I'll put a link to her channel in the description if you want to check out her This or That to see if our sewing preferences match up. So the first topic is sewing prep. So number one is, do you prefer shopping new or stash busting? So I was thinking about this and I think controversially I'm actually going to say shopping new. So this is potentially controversial because I run Stash Hub, so we're a sewing organiser app. We encourage people to, fall in love with their stash, use what they've got, and just have a generally more mindful approach to buying items for their sewing. But I think if you could only do one, you could only shop your stash forever, or you can only buy new, then for me, because I don't have a particularly extensive stash, I'd have to pick buying new, because I don't have all the types of fabric in my stash at the moment, so I'd be limited by that. There would be certain patterns that I couldn't make, so yeah, I'd have to go with buying new. But obviously, yeah, I do really like my stash and I would miss it, so this is an in-betweeny one. Obviously I am going to use my stash and I do enjoy using my stash, but yeah, I'd have to go with buying new if that was the one or the other option. Okay, so the next one is much easier for me. So the next question is PDFs versus paper patterns. PDFs every time. Yeah, some patterns have nice packaging, but the PDFs are just so much more convenient because you have you can have them on your phone, so you can check the instructions wherever you are, and you can get them printed. So I always get mine printed A0 because sticking together A4 sheets, as we've discussed, is terrible. But you can get them printed and then just cut out the size you want, and then you can print it again if you mess it up or you lose it or whatever, and they're slightly cheaper as well. So yeah, PDFs every time. I do have some paper patterns, like my vintage patterns, which I've got a video about, or also there's a few that I've got, if I've got them in a sewing subscription box or I bought them at a show or something. But yeah, generally I'll always go for a PDF pattern, as that's my preference. So the next part of sewing prep is cutting versus tracing. So as we just discussed with my preference of whether I prefer to buy PDF patterns or paper patterns, I generally always buy PDF patterns, which means I can get them reprinted, so I'll always cut them out. I will only sometimes do tracing if I want to make an adjustment, but I think, and I'm not sure if it's going to work, but I think generally tracing is much more time consuming than cutting out. So yeah, if I have to pick, I'm going cutting. So the next and final one of sewing prep is muslin or just go for it. So this is another dependy one. It depends on the type of the pattern, how fitted it is. Because if it's very boxy, like my Romy Raglan, which I wore in a previous video, but I wanted to wear it with my fab new earrings. If it's very boxy, then I don't feel like it's always necessary to do a toile. But if I had the choice of never doing a toile or always doing a toile, I'd probably always do a toile, because it's really annoying to spend ages making everything and doing all the steps and then it doesn't fit. And there are some adjustments that are really difficult to do after the garment is all sewn up. Like obviously if you just want to shorten a hem or something, that's easy, but for some adjustments that I need, like often I take length out above the bust or do a full seat adjustment, it's you can't do that really without ruining the whole thing. So yeah, I would go always do a toile, and then yeah, once you've done the toile as well, you know that it fits, and then you're much more confident to make more things. So the patterns that I've done, you know, extensive fitting for, like the Danny trousers and the Betty dress, I find I've made loads more versions of that because I know that it fits well and I don't have to faff with it anymore. Because if you do just like a quick and dirty toile where you just use like scrap fabric, you don't bother, you know, doing like understitching or linings or pockets or any of that sort of stuff, then you can always like cut into it and you can see like how much it needs to spread. For example, if it's a full seat adjustment, you can just slice it along and see how much you need to increase it by, and then you can always do kind of test out your adjustments on your toile as well by like adding bits in or taking bits out. And you can't really do that on a wearable toile because then it becomes unwearable. So yeah, I find it much quicker to do like a toile rather than a wearable toile. But yeah, like I said, I wouldn't tend to always do that if I'm limited on time or it's a pattern that I think is going to fit easily without too many adjustments. So topic number 2 is about fabric. So obviously as sewing enthusiasts, we all love fabric. So yeah, the first question is, do I prefer in-store or online shopping? So for me, I actually prefer online shopping because there's just so much more information available, and I find shopping in store quite overwhelming. Like, you know, there's all the colours everywhere and you know, it's just too much, and then often you don't get all the information about the fabric as well, so then you can like not know quite what it is, and then you don't know if it's suitable for a particular pattern. So yeah, I definitely prefer online shopping. It's also, just a little plug, much easier to add things from online shops onto your stash hub because you can just copy all the information across from the website. So yeah, I prefer online shopping, and because I'm a pandemic rising sewist, that means that online shopping was basically my only option when I first started sewing, so that's kind of what I'm used to as well. So yeah, that's an easy one for me, online shopping. The next is knits versus wovens, another easy one for me. Sewing knits I find a pain, and I think I prefer wearing wovens as well, so I'm going to go wovens for knits versus wovens. Yeah, my sewing machine has had these issues. I've got a fairly new sewing machine, but it has like broken a few times where the timing's gone out, and that always happens on knits. So I feel like knits are cursed for me. I don't sew a lot of knits, but I do really like sewing with wovens, especially more stable ones like cotton. Yeah, I just like an easy life. So the next one, this is a great section. This is going so easy for me right now. This is tumble dry versus hang to dry. As a British person, I don't have a tumble dryer. We've got, I think our washing machine does have a tumble dry like function on it, but in my experience that never works properly, and it just uses a lot of energy and potentially like ruins your clothes. So I always hang to dry. We've got one of these, I think it's called Dry Sewn from a Lakeland, which is like a clothes horse, but you can plug it in and it heats up. So that's really good in the winter to get stuff dry, because I live in a flat, so I don't have any outside space to dry stuff. But yeah, when I'm washing fabric, obviously that is quite big, so I'll have to just hang it over a door or something to dry it. But yeah, always hang to dry is my choice for that one. Next up is rotary cutters versus scissors. I'm gonna go rotary cutters with this one. I'm not gonna beat around the bush. I think, yeah, so I've got an A0 cutting mat that basically covers my whole table, and because I get my PDF patterns printed by Plan Printing 24, they come on kind of thickish regular paper. So if I were to cut with scissors, and then I'd have to pin the pattern pieces on, and I think that would be more awkward with the printed patterns rather than the tissue paper patterns, which will pin easily. So yeah, I just lay it out. I've got these little weights that are like they're just big washers that my dad got me from Screwfix, and then I can just zoom around with my rotary cutter. But yeah, now's a good time for me to remind you to replace the blade on your rotary cutter, because it always makes your life so much easier than you think, doesn't it? So yeah, rotary cutter is the one for me. So next up is construction, so the actual sewing part. We're getting to the meaty bit now. So number one is follow the pattern instructions or just wing it. So for any pattern that I've never made before, I think I would follow the pattern, just because I think buying a pattern is not just for the pattern pieces, you're also buying the instructions, and different pattern companies have like different ways of doing things, and some companies have really clever ways of construction, so reading the constructions is a great way to learn more about sewing. Like if I had to pick follow the pattern or wing it, I would pick follow the pattern, because I wouldn't just be buying new patterns and then making it up as I go along. I don't think I'm that like experienced enough at sewing to get away with that, for one thing. But if I have a pattern and I've made it once and I thought the construction, like it just didn't quite like make sense for me, or I thought about it and I came up with a different way, a better way of doing it, then I would do it my way. But it's still, I wouldn't describe that as winging it. I would say that that's more thought through than winging it. So I'm going to talk to you about this kind of scenario. If what I'm saying right now isn't making any sense to you, then I will tell you more about it in the Project Dress a Girl video that I've got coming out in a couple of weeks. So there is a children's dress pattern that I've been making, and the instructions have a construction method that I found kind of awkward, so I've adapted it so the pattern kind of basically turns out exactly the same, but I'm just constructing it in a slightly different order, because that makes more sense to me and I found easier. Number two of clothing construction is bias tape finish versus facings. So bias tape for me, even before I got my amazing Simplicity bias making machine, which obviously means that now I have to bias tape everything. Yeah, I just think that facings, like you don't often see facings in like ready to wear garments that much. And I think it's just because they're less comfortable to wear. Like when they flap out, it's really annoying. So yeah, I think bias tape for me is the way to get a nice neat finish. Obviously, like in an ideal world you'd have both as an option, but yeah, if I had to pick one, I would do bias tape. The next question is serged seams versus French seams. If I've got to pick one, it's serged seams. It's just much quicker and much easier. I think sometimes you've got to do a bit more brain work to figure out how to get the like French seams to work, like especially around pockets. There's a tutorial that I have to follow every single time. But yeah, obviously French seams do have their place if you're using a particularly delicate fabric, for example, or you just want a really special finish on your garment, or maybe even you just don't have an overlocker. So yeah, I mean, I don't think French seams are particularly difficult and they do give a nice finish. For ease, I'm picking serged seams for this one. Number four, I don't even know why this is on the list, because who is picking button fly over zip fly? Probably nobody. Like zip fly is just so much easier to like use and wear, and also like sewing a zip is definitely not more difficult than sewing like 6 buttonholes or however many you're going to need. So yeah, definitely zip fly. I don't know if anyone said button fly. Let me know in the comments if that's your preference. So number 5 is sewing on buttons by hand or by machine. This is one of my only scenarios where I'm picking hand sewing over machine sewing. I always sew my buttons on by hand. I don't think it's that difficult. And in my experience, when I've sewn buttons on using the machine, they've fallen off, and my hand sewn buttons have never fallen off. So yeah, I trust my hand sewing of buttons more than machine sewing. And also like setting up the machine is kind of a faff because you've got to drop the feed dogs and put the special foot on. So yeah, for me it's hand sewing the buttons every time, easy peasy. Number 6 is Fusible versus Sewn interfacing. I have never used Sewn interfacing. I'm not really sure like what it's for. I think probably if you're more into like more advanced tailoring type thing, then maybe you go for Sewn. But yeah, I always just use Fusible for ease. Number 7 is Snip as you go versus all at once. So I assume this means snipping off the threads. So I've got a thread cutter on my machine, which I love. So yeah, I'll always use that before I get the fabric off the machine. And then yeah, I do tend to snip as I go rather than doing it at the end, because then you have to like search for all the threads and it's just easier to do it whilst you've got it there. Number 8 kind of follows on from this, because that number 8 is press as you go or press all at once, which yeah, I tend to press as I go, just because where, you know, if you've got seams that overlap, it becomes difficult to press the first seam after you've put the second one on. So yeah, just for ease, it's press as you go. And in my sewing station, I've got my overlocker, my sewing machine, and then I've got a little pressing station which uses a pressing mat, so that I don't have to set up the ironing board and I don't have to stand up to do pressing. So I think probably my habits might be different if it was like a lot more effort to get up and do a press. But yeah, I can literally just wheel my chair along, do a little press, and then get on to sewing the next bit. All right, so now we're on to the final section, which is sewing habits, a little peek behind the scenes. So the number 1 is late night sewing versus daytime seamstress. So yeah, I would say generally I'm a daytime sewing person. I'm just generally a daytime person anyway. Not particularly a morning person, but I'm also not a night owl. I'm just a regular day person. My experience of sewing like over the whole night at the big sew off actually was really interesting, and I did much better than I thought I did, like being able to stay awake the whole time, because I do get very sleepy. But yeah, that was really good and I got so much done, so that kind of tempted me to be like, oh, maybe I'll stay up all night and do some sewing. But yeah, no, I don't think actually that's practical. So yeah, I'm gonna go daytime sewing for this one. Number 2 is slow and steady versus frantic sewing. And I would say I'm definitely a slow and steady. I think I'm quite slow at sewing. When I was at the big sew off, the FAF machines that they've got at the new craft house, the like maximum speed is like double the maximum speed of my machine that I've got at home. So yeah, even just like physically the sewing on the machine, I think I'm probably fairly slow. But yeah, it takes me quite a long time to make things, and I will unpick things if I decide it's like not good enough for what I think it should be. So yeah, definitely slow and steady, and I don't really enjoy having to like rush for a deadline or anything like that. So yeah, I would go slow and steady over frantic sewing anytime. The final question is tidy as you go versus one big cleaning session. So I tend to do a big clear up at the end of a project to try and like clear the decks and get the pattern put away, and yeah, like move on from that project. I think it's quite cathartic to have a big clean then. I'm not the tidiest like just person in general, so if things do get a bit out of hand in the middle of a project, I'll have to have a bit of a sort out. But yeah, I'd say generally one big cleaning session, because yeah, I find it a bit pointless to have like a proper tidy up in the middle of a project, because then you'll have to just get everything back out again. But yeah, I am lucky that I've got a sewing station set up, so I can always leave things out there, rather than, you know, having to put everything like back in the cupboard or whatever. So yeah, that's my situation. My sewing area can be in different states of disarray depending on what I'm working on and how I'm feeling about it at the time. So yeah, sometimes it's looking very chaotic in there, but between projects it's usually quite good. And I think having to clear the cutting table to cut out on the table is quite good sort of reset because I have to clear everything off the table in order for that to be available, that space. So yeah, I'm gonna go for one big cleaning session. I hope you enjoyed that sort of peek into my sewing practice and my sewing preferences. Let me know if you agree, if you agreed with every single one. I definitely want to know, because then we're probably quite aligned in how we sew and probably how we think as a person as well. So on the topic of behind the scenes of people sewing, I started a new series called Stash Chats, where I am going to be chatting to members of the sewing community every week about their personal sewing collection and how they manage their stash and how they feel about it and all that sort of thing. So I'm running them on Instagram, so I'm using Instagram Lives. The first episode was on Thursday at 8 p.m. and I spoke to Sandeep of System in Taka about her personal fabric stash and kind of how running a fabric shop impacts her personal stash, and it was just a really interesting chat. So I'll put a link to the YouTube recording of that, but you can also watch them on Instagram as well. Then so the next one will be live on Instagram at 8 p.m. next week, and that will be with Zoe, who's the host of the Check Your Thread podcast. So yeah, I'm really excited to hear about her approach to stashing and, you know, sustainability, because that's a big focus of hers, and also the last Sew a Standing challenge that she's taking part in, which means she hasn't bought any fabric for ages. So yeah, it'll be really interesting to see how she's found shopping her stash exclusively, which was something that I decided early in the video that I couldn't do. So I will put a link down in the description to that if you're interested, and also let me know if there's anyone whose stash you're really interested to find out more about as well, because yeah, I'll be getting more guests on for the future weeks. Yeah, thanks for watching and supporting my channel. Don't forget to like this video if you thought this kind of chatty content was kind of interesting, and yeah, I'll be back next week with another video. Bye!